as excited as I am. So we're very lucky to be joined by Dr. Sereana Naepi, who is an Indigenous Fijian Ngaita City Pālangi lecturer in sociology at the University of Auckland. And Dr. Naepi's work uses multiple approaches to explore how universities and wider research sectors can become places that embrace all learners, that esteem all knowledges, and that serve all communities. She draws on both qualitative and quantitative methods that are shaped by Pacific research methodologies. And her research branches out into multiple disciplines in order to maximize impact across the academy. The values of relationship and service are foundational to her research approach. And prior to becoming a researcher, Dr. Naepi worked supporting Indigenous students for over a decade in Aotearoa and in Canada. So bula vinaka, and thank you for being with us, Sereana. We're also very lucky to have with us Associate Professor Stephen Threadgold. Stephen is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Newcastle. His research focuses on youth and class, with particular interests in unequal and alternate work and career trajectories, in underground and independent creative scenes, and in the cultural formations of taste. Steve is the co-director of the Newcastle Youth Studies Network, an associate editor of Journal of Youth Studies, and is on the editorial boards of the Sociological Review and the Journal of Applied Youth Studies. His latest book is Bourdieu and Affect, Towards a Theory of Effective Affinities, and his book Youth, Class and Everyday Struggles won the 2020 Raewyn Connell Prize for Best First Book in Australian Sociology. So kia ora, Stephen, thank you for being with us, and a warm welcome to you. And I'll now pass over to our co-coordinator, Nili.
Kia ora, thanks Tavi. So my name is Nilima and I'm a postdoctoral fellow in organizational psychology at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. So also a warm welcome from me from Europe to everyone who's present. And before we get started with the main session, I'd like to just say a few words on housekeeping. So we'll be running the session today as an informal panel discussion. So for about the first hour or so, Octavia and I will be asking the panelists to discuss their thoughts in response to some questions that we have prepared. Our speakers are going to try and keep their responses to around 5 or 7 minutes. So if you see a celebration emoji pop up, we're just signaling to our panel that they need to start wrapping up the response, but I'm sure that'll be all very good. So, and then for the last 15 minutes or so, we'll then hand over to you. Oh yeah, Marie's just demonstrating to us what it will look like. And so you'll have 2 options for asking your questions. So you can use the chat function for questions at any point. And depending how many we get, we might try and collate these. But you can also ask your question directly. So when the time comes, we'll ask you to raise your hand. You should have that at the bottom of your screen on your dashboard. And of course, you can unmute yourself and then you can just put forward your comment or question. All right, so let's get started with our question time. So the first one is, can you tell us what a focus on affect and emotion brings to your research? So how does affect and emotion help us in studies of equity or in the higher education context? Who would like to go first?
Thank you, Stephen. Nicely played. I think I've been thinking a little bit about this since I got the invitation to the Stella Noa, and I think of thinking about how affect and emotion works in the research is it sometimes can be a tool for change, if that makes sense, where as someone who uses both quantitative and qualitative, I understand the power of numbers to convince people, but it's actually the qualitative stories that provide that provide that emotive response that inspires people to change. So you can see that 1.7% of academics are Pacific in our country, in Aotearoa. But when you hear the stories of racism that they face, that sort of, when people have that emotive response and they think about what it means to hear a story about a Pacific person who's gone through the whole process, done everything they were told to do, got the PhD, hasn't been earning money for the collective family, has done everything they were told to do, and then they cannot find a job, and what that means for their collective well-being, for the community, that tells us something different to the 1.7%. And I think that that's where I quite like the use of affect and emotion in research in equity, is that it's a driver for change. The downside of that is that you can't really do this work without affect and emotion, right? Like it's emotional work. And I think we're going to talk about that a little bit later in the panel. But for me, that's how I see it as a moment in this research, is that you're able to use, if you have a really good understanding of how affect and emotion work, you can use it to push for change and to agitate for change. But if you try to block it out of equity research, you miss something and you're not able to push the change that needs to happen. I'm going to pass it to Stephen now.
Yeah, I would echo that. I mean, I think as someone who's a qualitative researcher, and someone who kind of is increasingly politically kind of oriented against economic and psychological kind of figures of young people that dominate the way we kind of represent young people in politics and media or whatever, that the focus on effects and emotions can kind of be somewhat of an antidote of that kind of dehumanizing things. And also in terms of the way that inequality is just constantly kind of used, represented through quantitative measures, as you were saying, is misses out on that kind of nitty gritty of day-to-day life. So for instance, that's one of the reasons we're doing research in the higher ed space. I don't really like using those terms like socioeconomic status or even things like inequality or equity. Because I always try and use the language of class, because I think it that those other kind of terminologies tend to individualize or pathologize inequalities, whereas if we can focus on class relationships, it kind of foregrounds the entrenched nature of those kind of relationality. And it shows there's a kind of zero-sum game going on here in terms of scarcity of resources and stuff like that. So for me, the focus on emotions and I suppose affect has been as much a kind of political move as it has been a methodological one. But it was also a kind of reaction to kind of doing, hundreds of interviews where, affect and emotions are the things that come out in those things. So in my own kind of research trajectory, I started to turn towards those ideas, not writing out the discursive, but kind of bringing those things into kind of conversation with each other, I suppose. So, and one of the reasons I think affect and emotions are so important in the higher education space is to also focus on the way that higher education is a maker of class, not a panacea for it. I think there's assumptions in both policy, but and also in more general understandings that once someone gets to university, they're okay, and they're going to have the good life and the good career. And we just kind of, we all know as social scientists that's not really the case. So so the work that I've done particularly with Matt Bunn and Penny Jane Burke in this space is to kind of, I suppose, focus on the emotional demands of university, of what it costs people to go. And I don't mean in terms of money, in terms of having to move away from their family, or, having to work a full-time job and, do 30 hours of study, or, look after their relative while living 40 k's from the university or whatever. And the discourses of hard work and making the right choices and investing oneself in education are all well and good, but they don't mean very much when those material inequalities kind of, I suppose, come into play with the choices young people can make. So yeah, I think it's really important there to treat higher education as a kind of effective space as much as a discursive space. And I think focusing on that kind of mundane everyday relations that young people struggle with in higher education, you know, can draw out that it's actually a really reasonable decision to drop out of university. It's not a failure. It's actually something that like maybe should be encouraged in some situations. Like, yeah, you know, we can't say that in the higher education space, right? Because we need numbers and we need students. And so I think we do need to emphasize a little bit more the costs, the emotional costs for people, particularly from disadvantaged backgrounds, face when they come into university. And also, you know, the idea that like no matter how much someone emotionally invests themselves, works hard, all that kind of stuff, there can be things that get in the way that make that process really difficult. And those kind of things disappear when we just see numbers on pages and human capital and you know, young people represented as lazy, making the wrong choices, cultural dupes, all that kind of stuff.
I really like that, Stephen. Like the rethinking how we think about higher ed, how we think about higher ed research and making sure we bring the emotional in. It's quite interesting that the work that we did with the quant work, everyone was like, oh yeah, let's pay attention to that now. But the moment that we, the work that put the numbers in, everyone went, yeah, we've known that for ages, because we've been sharing stories of racism and we've been putting our emotions out there for everyone to read and for everyone to experience the trauma of working in these spaces that constantly reject you. And our students are being in spaces that constantly reject them. Yet, how do we get people to pay attention? And I liked how you that push to say, actually, existing in higher ed doesn't just cost money, it costs emotions and it costs resources. And it made me think of, there's a Fijian scholar who talked about talanoa. So talanoa is a research method that enables us to create knowledge through relationship. And there's a very specific Fijian talanoa, wakamosi yalo, which is painful to the spirit or soul. So we've got very specific languaging that recognizes that to make knowledge, sometimes it's painful. But we also have the opposite, which is wakamoru taka nayalo, which is causing happiness to one's spirit or soul. So there's like a recognition that to create knowledge and relationship to other people, you need to feel something. And I think that it's quite cool to think about how do we bring that into our research space and to our institutions that don't want to talk about it. You know, they, like you said, it's about numbers and recruitment. They don't want to talk about, imagine if we said to them, oh no, I told that student they should drop out, it's probably best for them.
Yeah, thank you both. Stephen, did you want to kind of respond or take it further, or shall we progress at this point?
Yeah, the other thing I would say, I suppose, just is that also when looking at effects and emotions, we shouldn't just look at the people that are disadvantaged or we are worried about in terms of dropping out or having problems. We should also really be looking at privilege as well, and the way that that works as a kind of, you know, an emotional lubrication through these spaces. So it's in my work, it's what I talk about in terms of social magic and things like that, where, you know, people in certain spaces have the right dispositions and all that kind of thing. So it just makes things easier for them, and they still have to work hard and make the right decisions and all that kind of stuff. But it's a much different effective register than, you know, having all kinds of obvious material and dispositional inequalities on that trajectory. So the work we've been trying to do is to track people from degrees into the labour market. We're struggling to get funding for that, by the way, because we're not doing quant research, which is kind of the irony that we kind of face all the time when we're doing this stuff. Yeah, we've done some kind of small pilot studies on that, and yeah, I might go into that a little bit later on, but like, yeah, I think, yeah, it's important to not just to focus on the disadvantage, but also to kind of recognize advantage and emphasize how that works as well, not just focusing on one side of the coin, I suppose.
Absolutely. And I think that kind of pulls us quite beautifully into the next question that maybe we can move on to. So this is a kind of longish question, but rest assured, if you're listening, we have given it to people to look at in advance. I always take a long time to process long questions, so we're not just hitting people with it. But before I do that, I just want to let anyone know who's joined us that this is being recorded. So if you'd like to turn your videos off, you're welcome to. We love seeing your faces, but you may or may not want to be part of the visual record. So just totally up to you. All right, onto this question I've been talking up. So one of the ways that we can try to describe larger scale emotional patterns is to borrow from Raymond Williams' concept of structure of feeling, where a loose cluster of ideas might come to guide action at any particular given point in history. And we're interested, Stephen and Sereana, are you able to comment on what broad logics or structures of feeling may be present in higher education right now related to equity? Or to ask that question a slightly different way, what are some of the dominating ways of thinking and talking about equity that circulate in universities today, and which groups become affected and how? And I think some of what you've been discussing around meritocratic discourses is kind of and the importance of the flip side and the kind of which emotional styles are privileged. It's going to be really relevant there. Sereana, I wonder if you wanted to have a go with this one. Should we start the other way? All right, Stephen, it's up to you.
Okay. So yeah, this is a good question. I think I struggled really to focus on a kind of small answer for this. So I think maybe you like to think about it in terms of structures of feeling in higher education. There's the academics, and there's students, and different groups are affected by stuff differently. I think the just the ever burgeoning feeling of precarity in academia, and I use precarity there as a kind of an effective atmosphere rather than the kind of idea of class that Standing talks about. This has had huge effects on, I think, the way that we as social scientists can relate to our students and fight for our students, and have kind of voices in academia. I mean, Jessica Gerard and I were lucky enough to interview Raywin Connell a few weeks ago for a class in Australia book that we're doing, and she was talking about just back in the 60s or whatever, setting up sociology courses based on activism and all this kind of stuff that sounded like another alien world to me. Like it's impossible to even think about like the ability to do those kind of things in so this kind of idealistic way. So I think a really key structure of feeling is the precarity of higher education for academics, and I think this leads to what I've called in another context reflexive complicity. And I don't say that in like accusingly of everyone. I certainly include myself in that as well, is that we're kind of left stuck in many ways, just kind of fighting to keep our head above water, and tend to be kind of being almost reflexively complicit of what's going on in our institutions, even though we kind of make the right noises here and there. And so, for instance, my university is currently using the language, of renewal to kind of try and clear out level C's because they want more level B's. And so this kind of constant kind of shifting of the goalposts, where people have just been promoted from level B's to level C's, but now they're under threat because they don't fit the profile of what's going on. So, and I think the same thing goes on in universities around notions of innovation and creativity. They're kind of been almost bastardized, those terms, to kind of completely reverse what they really mean. So, yeah, it seems to me that most of the innovation that happens in a university now, for instance, is to get around many of the procedures and the things that get in the way of actually doing the core business of research and teaching. So there's those kind of precarity kind of related things for academics in particular. And obviously that's the case for students as well, and particularly the precarious nature of the transition from higher education to the labour market. And in terms of those kind of, the way the kind of various discourses work and create these structures of feeling, things like employability and what our university at the moment is calling work-ready graduates. I think these are really kind of key things that affect the way that students think about their study and the way that academics therefore teach their students. I think they're really kind of classic forms of effective violence, to be honest. They're used in our institutions to kind of justify kind of, you know, STEM and these things. Apparently there's more jobs in those fields, which is absolutely not the case. You know, there's an ever-growing rise of care work and stuff needed in society for, you know, I suppose largely to fix the problems the economic system is creating. And employability here seems to kind of have connotations of being flexible, being, you know, able to brand yourself, to hustle, to be confident in any situation or whatever. But these things, you know, very much look to me like comfortable middle-class dispositions that are actually excluding many of the people that take up space in universities. So, yeah, in terms of the people affected by this kind of stuff, I think everyone is in different ways, as we kind of discussed in the first part. And in the research of what I was mentioning earlier on, you know, what we find here is students come to the university from disadvantaged backgrounds and tend to think the university is going to do the job for them, to kind of, they'll get the degree and that'll get them the job. And we know that isn't the case. More privileged people are coming in and, you know, furiously networking, doing all the other stuff that's needed. But of course, they don't talk about it as networking. They, you know, they're organizing business balls and, you know, social events and stuff like that, but they're very much kind of doing that, taking up the right volunteers, doing the right internships. So these discursive things about employability or work ready, again, seem to just reflect fairly privileged dispositions, I think. I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Thank you, Stephen. I think that some of the piece you spoke about with precarity, I'm involved in the early career researchers community, and you know, we saw when COVID-19 hit, we not me, another group organized an online forum, and we had over 200 early career researchers attend because they were terrified about what that meant for them. And we've got a gathering happening in June, and we sold out of 250 tickets in 24 hours because people are so worried. And what does it do to a growing research sector that everyone is so worried about their future, even though we've been promised a bright future? You know, did all the things, got the PhDs. Oh, sorry. Turns out that it's a little bit of luck. It's not really about your CV. And I think that in itself is quite, to have a just anxiety across the board is an interesting space. And then when I think about the other two things I want to touch on, when I think about a key emotion in this work, it's sort of that constant frustration from those of us who are within the equity groups trying to make change, because it's the same conversations we've been having again and again and again and again. And how many times can you say the same thing and be heard, but then not be heard, sorry. And then I sort of think about how the the neoliberal model just keeps us busy. So you add that layer of you're lucky to have a job, keep busy, and you get what Graham Smith talks about as the politics of distraction when we're talking about decolonisation and equity work in the universities, where we're so distracted because we're so busy, because we're so scared for our jobs, we can't actually do the equity work that needs to happen. Because if you're the person who speaks out, at best, you're a stereotype of a Pacific woman or a Māori woman around, or just basically a brown woman in our universities, where you're angry as opposed to having a logical argument. And it, like, you have that deep fear of speaking out because of precarity. And can you speak out, or do you kind of just have to grow a thick skin? And there is this sort of conversation, the same lean-in feminism conversation that is happening in sort of decolonisation and racialized bodies work, where we're being told, lean in to the system, that's how you'll change it. Whereas, because otherwise, how can you guarantee a job? How can you guarantee these other, like, how can you fulfill the promise of your degrees if you're being too loud? You won't get invited to the table. And I think that feeling of precarity, anxiety, and frustration kind of makes this real mess when you're trying to do equity work. And then I want to think a little bit about Kasia Henneque talks about pausing and sense making with decolonisation and actually moving towards sense sensing in higher ed. And in particular, I'm a Pacific female academic. And while I was doing my PhD on Pacific women's experiences in universities, we lost two stunning Pacific female academics way before their time. And what I wanted to do is to kind of pause this moment of sort of critiquing and engaging our minds, and to call on some of our magical Pacific poets, who there's 2 poems. So the first one is by Kalo Mila, who's an amazing Tongan poet, which was for Tarasia Te Oia when the community came together for a night of poetry and thinking, when it was made public that Tarasia was really unwell. And she she starts, I mean, I kind of go halfway through, and I'm really sorry, Kalo, because your words are beautiful. But so she says, "You are the first of us, young ones, the OG feminist, Dr. Dusky Maiden, who famously cried salt tears and sweat ocean, creating a wake wide enough for so many of us who followed. In the deep multicolor of your wide, wonderful wake, I am thinking of one word, huleau, described to me once by a Tongan artist, but no Google search reveals its meaning. As you well know, the stuff really worth knowing isn't found on Google. Although I see in Hawaiian, huleau means climate and sister, climate changer feels right to me. We felt you change the climate, Tere, daughter of Oceania, ambiguously native, kin somehow to all of us, even as polys, while calling us out our volume and our repetitive raw fish. So that's a section of Kalo's words about Tarasia when she passed, and then when she was unwell before she inevitably passed. And then Tarasia's sister, Sereana, then had to write a tribute for Tracy Banewanua Ma, who passed in 2017. And her one, I think it's as well, is quite interesting when we're thinking about affect and emotion and sensing. So hers is for Fiji women scholars who are brilliant, strong, and wary. And it goes, it is okay to rest. Your head, your gut, filled with decolonial concerns in a sea of white Australia. It is okay to rest. Your heart, your soul, filled with deep care for Indigenous pasts and presents and futures. It is okay to rest. Your hands that typed and typed and typed and typed. Your books filled with decolonial revelations about an ocean of blue and black and brown South Sea islands. It is okay to rest. And I wanted to share those poems because I think that you can't, it's deeply disturbing that you can't be a Pacific woman working in higher education without a feeling of deep sadness or deep loss, because this work means we lose people too early, and then we have to process that loss while continuing the battle. And I think there's something to be said when there's something in Kasia Heneku's saying, let's stop trying to make sense of this and instead sense it. Let's really sense what it means to work in decolonial work in higher ed.
Thank you so much, Sereana. I'm sort of still in that affective mode of the poems, so trying to get back into into thinking about the questions. Stephen, did you want to add anything on that topic? Or yeah, that's, again, I think that actually sort of leads us a little bit into the third question. Thinking about Sarah Ahmed and how equity work is actually really, or can be really painful, can be really tiring, and I think that's partly what you were just referring to. But thinking about another sort of facet of Ahmed's perspective is, she asks, what does diversity do? And answers this question with the claim that a focus on diversity rather than equity has become a PR exercise for universities. And Stephen, you mentioned earlier, you don't even like using the word equity, you like to focus on class. So that's maybe also interesting to look at all these different terms. but basically, she's saying that the kind of negative noises of racism, sexism, classism, and other isms are sort of drowned out by, in Ahmed's words, the happier buzz of diversity. So I would be really interested to hear if you could comment on the task that universities have to kind of do both diversity and equity. And I guess universities don't really talk about class, but you might want to say something about that, Stephen. So basically wondering what might come out of harnessing the negativity born out of greater discussions of inequities rather than focusing on diversity.
Do you want me to go first this time? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Well, okay. I'm not sure I have a lot of positive things to say about this. Please remember, like, yeah, like in the background here, like our university is going through its like 5th restructure in 11 years. So this kind of speaks into the things that we're talking about here. I mean, I think Ahmed is totally right. And as I said before, I think universities are places that enact inequalities rather than being some kind of panacea for them. And I've written about that when it comes to class. And you can see that when it comes to equity policy and things like that, when universities go through restructures, right? So, you know, there's a kind of circular thing that happens where there'll be some kind of crisis, there'll be a bunch of cuts, and then throughout the next 3 or 4 years, all the things that were cut will have to be brought back in because, you know, we need them to support disadvantaged students, but they're always the first things that get cut, and it just goes round and round. So I think that in and of itself, and if anyone's that worked in a university for more than a couple of years will see that just constantly happen over and over again. So in terms of what, you know, generalizing a little bit of what it says there, I mean, I think university management will embrace any kind of bullshit to do something about, you know, to not do something about the status quo, but to pretend they are. And I mean, by bullshit there, I'm actually using a conceptual term. Like David Graeber's work on bullshit jobs in particular, I think is just every university management person should be made to read that book. So, you know, universities are both these anxiety and bullshit producing machines, but, you know, obsessed by rankings we all know are meaningless, and, you know, notions of impact kind of morph into like whatever you want it to be. Yeah, I was thinking of that kind of famous Marx quote of all that solids melt in the air. And I think in a university context, it's like all that's ethical kind of melts into bullshit. So, you know, this is typical of any corporation, and that's what universities increasingly are. And the university structures are kind of like incredible class system. Let's face it, you have all the higher ups, you know, need a bunch of lackeys around them to show how important they are. Then they need a bunch of what Graeber calls duct tapers to actually clean up the mess that they make with their nonsense. So then they just kind of sack the people and move on to the next place. And, you know, sacking people in those jobs is a form of symbolic capital. So yeah, this is the kind of management structure that universities have, and they've had it for a couple of decades now. And that obviously that means that kind of anything about diversity would lead to kind of that United Colors of Benetton kind of understanding of what diversity means. So, and for those, you know, on the ground that are increasingly frustrated by this stuff, you know, we just end up having this kind of listless, frustrated, head against the wall thing. And like in our cluster at the moment, our sociology and anthropology cluster, like there's people there that have been there. I've been there for 10 years, but there's been people there for longer. And we're like, okay, we make all these cuts, but we've just basically got the files and we've moved them aside to kind of ready to reintroduce them in a couple of years to try and, you know, do the equity work that some of our courses had, that all the support's been cut. So yeah, I think it's 100% correct, as she often is. And as dismal as that sounds, but I also think from an individual point of view, I mean, I know that the work that I do in courses makes differences in people's lives. And, you know, it's great, you know, you run into students 5 years later and they talk about a particular lecture you gave or gave them a particular concept that makes them think about things differently. So, yeah, I think that's where I think as an individual academics and social scientists, we can make a difference and, you know, understand the plight of our students. You know, talking before, I think, I can't remember, was it in the before when we were talking in the setup or in this thing, one of our courses now has the compulsory attendance. And so, you know, as far as innovation goes, I'm going to do as much as I can to get around that to ensure students don't fail, that they, you know, because they couldn't make it 9 out of 13 times or whatever. So that, you know, within the institutions, I think that's the kind of work we can be doing to address equity as our institutions kind of go up and down in addressing it, I think. Sorry if I went on too long there.
I really like
Stephen.
it. Sounds like I'm personally really grateful that we've had this opportunity, because the first thing I'm gonna do is email Stephen and be like, let's talk universities. But I when I was thinking about this question, I was thinking the institution I used to work in with Canada, we had an Indigenous counsellor who shared the same space with me, and we used to make jokes about taking like some gold stars to meetings and just handing them out and being like, here's your gold star for the day, you are a good person. Because whenever people talked about indigenizing the academy, all they really wanted was the gold star. They wanted the gold star that they could show their friends and say, look, I'm a good person, I did a good thing. They weren't actually invested in change in the same way that people who experience inequities are invested in it. They're invested in change that they can put on a CV, that they can use to advance themselves up the ridiculous structure and get a bullshit job. They're not interested in change that could possibly impact them. And I think that that's where inequity becomes difficult, because with inequity, you have to talk about privilege and you have to confront your privilege. And you're not really addressing equity unless people are leaving a room uncomfortable. And I think that that's quite a big emotive part of this work, is there are very few people who don't I work in equity, but I'm also my father's Pākehā and I grew up in East Auckland. So I have a certain amount of privilege in my positionality, and I'm permanently employed at a university. I deal with people who are facing precarity every day. And so having conversations that aren't just about Pacific as a homogeneous whole can be uncomfortable, because I'm slightly like, I'm better off than a lot of people in that room. And so when we talk about equity and we talk about inequities, you have to be uncomfortable. And I think that's why people push it away. And the universities, we know this, right? We've got racial capital. They want the brown person who's going to be on the poster that they can point out and go, look, we're amazing. We have this brown person who's at our university doing great things and we totally support them. We're not going to talk about that our university got rid of 50% of Pacific staff in 1 year when we restructured. We're not going to talk about how majority of our Pacific staff are on precarious contracts. And we're not going to talk about how the student that we're putting on this poster was not admitted to a graduate degree because of our stupid regulations. Because that doesn't help their brand. It's not useful to them. And I think that uncomfortableness of universities having to confront themselves is why we're not getting anywhere. The universities don't want to confront themselves. We see ourselves as the critic and conscience of universities and of the society, and I say ourselves because I'm part of the university. I always giggle when people are like, university. I'm like, you are the university. We are the university. But how do we push back against the management system that is all encompassing and keeping us really busy? So I think a little bit of a rant there, but I do think that there's something to be said about how do we force the university to confront itself? How do we force the university to be uncomfortable and it not be a brand management exercise? Because the moment my dad's a Sparky, and whenever we do media coverage for my work, he always goes, do you just want to lose your job? Because I go on national television and say my university is racist. So not my university, all universities are racist. Because if you say my university, they can call you into HR. And so how do we have these conversations in a way that makes the university want to change? And you have to do it in a way that gives them gold stars. Because if you're not giving out gold stars, they're not interested. And it's real frustrating because gold stars don't mean meaningful change. And I think that's where I'm at with this sort of conversation around diversity versus equity, and really, like Stephen said, trying to get funding for work on racism is quite hard. Getting funding for work on diversity and equity programs, that's a language they like. They like positive diversity initiatives. let's talk about racism. No, let's not do that. Let's not talk about inequity. And so you're doing the same research project, you just use a different language. And the universities, I guess I mean, I'm still here, so I hold out some hope. Otherwise, I start my own research company and get more money from the government to do the same work.
That sounds like a great plan, Sereana. I might join you.
Can I just say too, like, I don't want to be the kind of woe is me academic, like, either. Like, so our jobs are hard and they're busy, and, you know, the reason we do them and pursue them is they're actually good jobs, and we get to do stuff like this, right? And, you know, no good jobs in capitalism, all that kind of thing. So, but I do think that, you know, if our job contains this much activity, that the percentage of it is getting filled by kind of the bullshit that we're talking about is increasing, and it's making that space to actually do the good work more and more difficult, less and less time. And again, it all kind of goes into that kind of, you know, hard work. You know, everyone's got to kind of, if you want to be an academic, it has to be a whole life. It can't be a job. And so again, there's kind of balances, I think, are maybe the things that we can push back against in our institutions. But yeah, being an academic is a relatively privileged job. I definitely want to point that out, and don't have too much like woe is me kind of stuff going on there.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you both. Was there anything more that you wanted to add along those lines before we maybe segue into the individual questions that are a bit more focused specifically around pieces of work that you've both done? Cool. Let's jump into it. So this first question is for Sereana. And the question is, in a recent article reporting on talanoa with Pacific early career academics, you and your co-authors observed that academia is a space mired in colonial scripts and power relations that subjugate the position of Pacific knowledges in the classroom. And your analysis makes clear that, and I think, you know, your talanoa through this whole gathering has made clear that there are emotional dimensions to these colonial institutional scripts and these power relations. And we're really interested in your reflections on this as both a Pacific educator and an activist. So in your view, what are the emotional dimensions of the work that you've been undertaking in tertiary settings over, you know, this decade that you've been doing this work?
You just reminded me that the same person, I know who wrote that, but Patrick Thompson, he's a beautiful craftsman of work. We've got another paper coming out soon called Universities as Knowledge Prisons.
Well, watch out for it.
Yeah, so he's really great at spinning those moments of kind of go, oh wow, yeah. I think there's sort of three emotions that I think about, and one is, you know, as a professional staff member, my experience at the university and my emotions in the university are really different to what I experience as a Pacific academic. So as a Pacific professional staff member, pretty low on the pecking order, right? Frontline, student services, like 40 people between me and the VC. Meet the dean like once a year when he comes to the professional staff Christmas thing. Those emotions, I remember being, and I was a lot younger then. I think I was like 21 when I was doing that work. And I remember my manager like would constantly kick me under the table because I was angry. And so we'd go to meetings, and the only way I could think about how to get my students' voices heard was anger. And being angry about how the institution operated to ensure that our students were not valued, to ensure that our student, I worked with students who were targeted admission students. So if you're Māori or Pacific over 24, you could come to university. And students who came from just a really non-traditional background, and trying to explain to the university that you can't take students from non-traditional backgrounds and give them a traditional experience. It's not going to work. And so just being angry constantly, but also at that time quite a lot of joy, because I got to deal with frontline students, and you get to see them experience the university, go on to work in big spaces, to feel like they're having an impact on the world. That's one of the great things about the BA, right? Is people get involved in work that feels like they're changing the world. And some of them actually are in really cool ways. And so that professional staff environment was angry but joyful. I think as a Pacific academic, I'm exhausted but hopeful. Exhaustion just seems to be a common theme for a lot of Pacific academics. And I remember when I got my role, I was told, you're allowed to say no, and you're allowed to. And if my head of school is particularly wonderful and was like, if you need someone to be the bad white guy who says you're not allowed to do it, just tell me, and I will email whoever needs to be emailed and say she's not allowed to do it if you don't want to be the one who says no. And that exhaustion level doesn't go away, and it's a physical exhaustion, it's a mental exhaustion, and it's just exhaustion at doing the same work. I meet amazing Māori and Pacific academics who've been at this much longer than I have, and they were having the same conversations. So it's that exhaustion of repetitiveness. And when I first got my job at the university, a really senior Māori academic who I really treasure the time I get with him, the first thing, I thought he'd be real proud. So I told him, I was like, I got a job. He was like, I know, I'm very disappointed in you. And I was like, what? And he goes, don't worry, we all do our time at that university. And now I know what he means. The level of exhaustion and working in a giant bureaucracy when you have so much desire for change is just a different type of exhaustion. The work one of my collaborators always says, you're not going to solve racism this week. Just remember that. And then the other sort of emotion, I guess, is hope. You hope it's going to get better. And then there are moments like I've been invited to go to Wellington, and the people can't pay for me to go, and I was pretty gutted. And then I was able to email our PVC Pacific, which is a relatively new role, and he was like, yeah, sure, I'll sort it out. And so nothing has changed, but so much has changed, right? So the exhaustion at nothing changing is also weirdly paired with hope, because a lot has changed. I can email a PVC Pacific and say, I think this is a great opportunity. Do you know if anyone can support me? And that's not an opportunity that every academic gets. Sometimes you just have to say, no, I can't do it. And so I think that's where the way those sort of the colonials sort of scripting that Patrick, I assume it's Patrick, it might also have been Karamia, is talking about is exhausting, because it's almost written on you, but at the same time you find these spaces for hope, and the Pacific ECR group that I write with is another space for hope. We come together and we laugh and we encourage each other, and we talk about backroom conversations that someone's had with us, right? The undercommons is very real in that group. We share each other's secrets, like, oh, my head of school said I can apply for promotion if I do XYZ. Did your head of school not say that? And then we're able to go and be like, hey, do you know over there they're doing? And so it's a space of hope that I'm hopeful, I guess, is outweighing the exhaustion. And I think the moment it stops, right, Stephen was talking about how we have really good jobs. It's just that it's shifting. And I think that's where I'm at right now. I'm more hopeful than exhausted. But the moment I become more exhausted than hopeful, I'm going to need to shift, and no one should ever have to write a poem about me, right, or to me. I never want to be in a space where someone is writing a poem to me or to my family or about me, because it's not okay. And how do we interrupt that process and that cycle? Because exhaustion and hope as a pairing is pretty dangerous. Yeah.
Kia ora, thanks for that, Sereana. Yeah, you're quite right. It's quite a balancing act, isn't it? I do totally agree with you, though. It is important to remain hopeful, and thinking about affect and emotion theory is a good way of being able to think about power hierarchies differently, perhaps not quite so top bottom, as we might have done with, yeah, more sort of structural based work. Unless you had anything to add to that, Stephen, I've got one for you. Octavia mentioned earlier about a question being long. This one's really long, so bear with me. So in your new book, Bourdieu and Effect Towards a Theory of Affective Affinities, you discuss Bourdieu's notion of illusio and his claims that one of the cruelest forms of inequality is uneven access to, and I quote, reasons for living. That is, some people can't access particular motivations and aspirations for living. It's not possible, for example, for some to aspire to succeeding in higher education. Their social positioning prevents them from creating those emotional investments. And so usually we think about illusio from the perspective of the disadvantaged. And I wondered if you could talk a little on how the concept of illusio might be used to understand the actions and motivations of those who are relatively privileged. So those who are charged with shifting inequitable conditions in universities. And they typically understand themselves to be, maybe I should say, we typically understand ourselves to be highly emotionally invested in social change. So is it possible to use illusio to provide insights on why it is that change seems so slow despite strong emotional investments to notions of equity?
Okay, yeah. Thanks. This is a really thoughtful question. Thanks for putting it to me. And it does kind of really speak into the things that I was writing about in that book. So to answer the question, I thought I'd talk a little bit about what the concept of illusio means, or at least the way that I kind of develop it, I suppose. It's meant to be a concept to think about how there's kind of stakes or things to pursue in a certain field in that Bourdieu sense. But I kind of generalize it out a bit and think about it more about kind of the way that we need to create meaning in our lives. Otherwise, life would be meaningless. We'd face all those kind of existential horrors that implies. So we invest ourselves in all kinds of things to give ourselves meaning. And so if we can concentrate here a little bit on higher education, I'll talk about that. But you know, what would be the illusio of the field of higher education for academics? I mean, if we want to be generous, it'll be things like passing on important knowledge to our students to help them, you know, get on in life. For us as individual researchers, to, you know, create knowledge to make good policy, to make the world a better place. If we want to be a bit more cynical, it's, you know, moving up the professoriate or whatever, so you have more status or whatever. So there's all these different kind of purposes in the higher education field that we pursue. It's important to think about illusio as a concept to do research with, I think, as much as anything as well. It's not meant to kind of have connotations of being kind of that bullshit illusion stuff that we were talking about earlier on, but from the outside of a particular practice, an illusio can appear kind of absurd, right? So, you know, if you're an atheist, a priest's belief in God, for instance, would be absurd. An edge worker, you know, like climbing a mountain that could risk their life. From the outside, that seems absurd, but there's all kinds of illusio in that field that people are pursuing to do it. The sociologist's endless quest for funding from the outside might look quite absurd. And as someone that doesn't hang around with a lot of academics, like in terms of the illusio of my job, my friends are constantly taking the piss out of what I do. They just think it's absurd. So illusio in that sense is a way of thinking about those things. In higher education, you could also say that maybe the ideal illusios that I just kind of outlined are maybe dominated by other forms of illusio from other fields, the field of power, economics, neoliberalization, all that kind of stuff, the kind of dismal stuff we've been talking about in the earlier things. So that's what the term is kind of meant to be used for, and it's certainly the way that I've tried to develop it. So in terms of what that means in terms of privilege, it relates to kind of notions of kind of social magic and social closure, in the sense that the privileged tend to kind of magically have their own dispositional kind of attitudes and understandings of things, they kind of magically coalesce with the things that are needed to succeed in various social spaces. You know, and the reason I think Illusio is important in this sense is kind of much Borgesian research uses field, cultural capital and habitus and doesn't move beyond that, and therefore it doesn't really move on the kind of functional, I think. We need some of these other Bourdieu concepts, I think, to be emphasized to bring in emotion and effect. So Illusio is good for that. The other one is that I've been kind of trying to develop a little bit is the idea of conatus. This is, you know, the way the Bourdieu uses is kind of the idea that someone's particularism becomes the universal. The way people with, you know, more privileged cultural symbolic capital have the ability to kind of make the world in their own image. And this is kind of largely what privilege is, and we can see this throughout kind of all kinds of, you know, different professions in particular, those that get to kind of decide what's normal, as opposed to, you know, abnormal or crazy, or those get decides what's legal and not. These are the people that kind of get to make the world in their own image. So again, when it comes to privilege, and if I'm thinking here at the level of the student, I suppose I mentioned this earlier on, it kind of, this fundamentally critiques the idea of meritocracy. Basically, it's not that people that do well in education systems necessarily work harder or are more smarter or whatever. It tends that their dispositional kind of attributes have resonances with just what's required in those spaces. They have what I call affective affinities in the book. So I have all kind of examples of that. Again, it's not like the privileged don't work hard or don't make the wrong choices every now and then, but, you know, the idea that you had to go to the University of Newcastle to do law instead of the University of Sydney, for instance, is not the same as kind of, you know, not getting into university or never even thinking about university as a possibility for you. So that's why I think Illusio is quite interesting to think about this, because it brings in the idea of purpose into thinking about this. And I think that's very important if we're thinking about effective atmospheres and the way that people can invest themselves in things and the possibility of pursuing a particular purpose and having success, however that may be kind of measured in a particular space. So yeah, overall, that's the kind of the way that I've been using Illusio to think about those things. It brings in a kind of notion of investment of the self into things, and the possibility then of being able to kind of put your choices, your emotions, your investments into practice, I suppose. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, and I guess it links in with what you were saying earlier about, sorry, what was the term? Our complicitness. There was a term used.
Reflexive complicity, yeah.
Yeah. How Illusio may or may not fit in with what we're complicit in is a bit of a tricky.
Yeah, and I think traditionally in Bourdieu, or maybe Bourdieusian research, I'm probably overgeneralizing here, but like it's the idea that a field or whatever the object of study is has one kind of purpose, but I would argue that these spaces have multiple purposes. In fact, people are competing, struggling over the purpose of what a particular field or space does. So we can definitely see that in the conversations we've just had about our emotional investments in higher education and what it's for and who's winning, I suppose. I think, you know, you can broadly kind of think about this in most kind of different social practices that become meaningful for people. And I think, again, why Illusio is important is that if you invest yourself in something, it becomes central to how you think about yourself and think about who you are and what you're for, and whether you're being a good person or a successful person or whatever. And again, that kind of troubles the idea of choice, right? Because once you're emotionally invested in something, and once you've put a lot of time into things or put a lot of effort into something, you can't just kind of then opt out. So, you know, this is particularly the case for, I think, the students that struggle in higher education. They feel like they're going to let people down when they, you know, can't feel like they're not having success or whatever. You know, disadvantaged students in particular often get a lot of pride from their families, but then struggle in those spaces, and, you know, have all kinds of emotional problems because they feel like they're going to let down their mum and dad because they were first in school, first in family and university or whatever. So again, the purpose here, I think, is really important. People invest themselves in these things for all kinds of rewards or all kinds of different meanings. But, we have, as Bourdieu is well known for, different resources to pull that off. But it's that emotional investment stuff that I think is important to kind of consider more in that kind of mundane experience of inequality.
Yeah, really interesting to think about how people are being pulled in different directions, and that there's like a multiplicity and dynamism to the illusio, and some of the choices.
So the idea of social gravity, I think, is useful for that. That, like, we're pulled towards different things based on, who we are and, what Bourdieu calls habitus and, families and all that kind of thing. And some things have more pull than others. And again, I think that kind of thing's trouble. The idea of rational choice is obviously something that I've been particularly critical of.
Thank you. Before we go to questions, Sereana, did you have anything to add there? No, all good. Let's see if there's anything in the chat. Do raise your hand if you have a question. I can see Laura's hand raised. Can you unmute yourself?
Yes. Hello, nice to meet you. I'm Laura and I'm speaking from Italy, and I work in Berlin with Millie. Okay, so I have a question for Sereana. So you spoke about this ambivalent experience, I may say, so students that express anger and also hope, joy in a way. And I think that this is very important also. I am a philosopher, okay, so for criticizing the idea that emotions are just very specific episodes that have just one feature, okay, so I just feel anger, just this, and from now to this moment, just anger. So I think that is very interesting to see this ambivalent dimension of affective experience. And my question is, if you think that this ambivalent or mixed the dimension of the affective experience can have a role in triggering change. I mean, I also work in the pragmatist literature, and there we speak very much about the role of crisis. So an affective crisis or a real doubt that is triggered by something that is very strong for your life is really what can lead you to revise your way of thinking, feeling, and maybe also enacting. So I would like to hear if you have any idea about these complex feelings and change, and if they can help, because usually the complex feelings are seen as something that is bad, that just hinder our capacity for action. And maybe this is there are also something positive in this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Laura, for that great question. It made me think of Ballyhofer, who's one of our big Pacific theorists, and he talks about Pacific people being capable of they as a community, our ontological standpoint makes us capable of multiple emotions at once. So he uses the example of how we laugh and cry at a funeral. So all good Pacific funerals are full of wailing and tears and just insane amounts of laughter that if you're not part of the community, you sometimes can think is quite inappropriate, right? So people will tell a really bad joke about the person who's just passed, or share a like really terrible story, and everyone will laugh while crying. And he uses it as an example about Pacific people's capacity to, and we're not unique in this, but capacity to sort of have two emotions at once. And what does that mean? What does it mean if we're able to do these two, hold tension in this way? Like, it's something that people would look at and go, how can you be both sorrowful and joyful? And he thinks that that's something that Pacific people do really well, is hold that tension between the two. And I think that in terms of change, I think that the two that I use, so that the idea of exhaustion and hope, is dangerous because you can keep working until you're basically past. but is also powerful, because even when you're tired, you can take on, you have hope. So you take on these big structures and you take on ideas and you take on people because you're hopeful. But because a lot of the time, so I'm part of a collective that writes, and one of the things that we did, I don't know if any of you knew about the Waikato 6, but Linda Tohiwai Smith is sometimes referred to as the godmother of decolonial research education. And the University of Waikato decided that they would end 6 contracts, or they would end a couple of contracts, and Linda's was one of them, but there were 6 Māori academics who came forward and talked about racism in our universities. And as a collective, we came together and we got 6,500 academics from across the globe sign a letter to tell Waikato, do something about this. We believe these 6 Māori academics do something about this racism. And while that was happening, I had a 3-month-old. Another one of our collective was like 9 months pregnant. And our other colleagues who were also part of it were juggling quite a lot. But because we had a collective response, there was space for exhaustion and hope. And so I think you can have those 2 emotions and they can be powerful for change because we have a collective response in the decolonial work, right? So when I'm exhausted but hopeful, another member of my collective stands up and says, you rest now, your child is waking up every 2 hours, you are not doing the spreadsheet. But at the same time, there's space for me to be involved. And I think that that's where that emotive work and the effect, like we in the Indigenous Academy, you can't do knowledge without relationship. And so when we have those relationships, we have that ability to lift each other and have a collective response, which means that you can be exhausted and hopeful. And that still leads to change because you're surrounded by others who are hopeful, but maybe energized at that moment. In 2 days' time, they might be exhausted. And so I hope that answers your question. I think it does. But there's something powerful both for the institution and keeping us exhausted, but also for ourselves and being exhausted and hopeful. Yeah. I'm always scared of philosophers. You guys are so well read.
Oh no, please. No, thank you. Very, very, very helpful. And I also like that you say that in order to feel also this hope, I need to be with my colleagues, my friends within a collective. So this also is important to always remember that our effective experiences are always situated and are also kindred and triggered by our relationships. So thank you for reminding this. Thank you.
Thank you for that question and the wonderful response. Would anybody else like to ask a question? Oh, Millicent, go ahead.
There we go. Am I on? Great. So thank you so much to Sereana and Stephen, not only for today, but for all the work you're doing in this space. As Laura mentioned, I'm also a philosopher. We're associated with the Affective Societies cluster at the Free University in Berlin. And part of what we've been thinking about there, and I guess a big part of what we've been talking about today is how, you know, our habits of thinking and feeling are so bound up with the institutional environments that we're embedded in, such that, you know, and also those institutional environments, they're localized. So, you know, the affects and emotional relationalities that are at play in a given university in the Australasian context might be very different from one in the European context. There'll be differences even within different universities within the Australasian context. And I wonder if that's part of the challenge, is saying, okay, we've got these localized affective communities such that, you know, we require really local, creative, context sensitive interventions. And so I guess my question is, and I think this has already really come out in the discussion, but maybe it's just a way of expanding on it. whether you know of any kind of local attempts to embed alternative knowledge systems and imaginaries within these existing institutional structures. Sorry, I'm a philosopher too, so sorry if that was a bit turgid and a bit dry. I hope that made sense.
Thanks, Millicent. Who wanted to take that one on?
I'll start, and then Stephen, do you want to go, or do you want to go first?
Well, yeah, just quickly, like, yeah, I did kind of touch on it before, like we've, in our programs, do this all the time. We have restorative justice stuff going on and all kinds of things like that happening. They tend to run for a couple of years, become really successful, start doing their jobs, and then they get cut because they're, deemed as, cuttable things. They're not just delivering a course. They take money, support, and all that kind of thing. So in my relatively short experience over the past decade, I suppose, yeah, there's been a very cyclical nature of being able to do that, what I think is good, important work, and bring other voices, organisations, perspectives into the university. But they do tend to be the first things that disappear. That often then affects the relationship you have with those groups and people, because they feel ripped off or they've been basically exploited in that kind of Ahmed way that she was talking about. So the important thing is, I think, is to keep doing it and not give up, I suppose. I mean, yeah, again, I think we're going through the 4th Indigenization of the curriculum in our university, and sometimes people are doing it for the gold star, other times that people taking it seriously. It kind of depends where they're at in their own career and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I think the important thing is just not give up on it, and then bring it back when you can and make as much complaints as you can to make sure that those things are seen as important by upper management, rather than just kind of additions to the delivery of a course or whatever. Really, they need to exist all the time rather than just whenever they can be afforded. Yeah.
Yeah, I do. I think Stephen's got a really good point. There's how do we embed it? There's really cool stuff happening. I've taken part in Canada on a learning from the land course, where we quite literally, it was a 5-day course, a graduate course, where we looked at the different healing from the land. So we went to mountains, rivers, lakes, mountain, river, lake, trees, and like one of the assignments was sit beneath tree and tell me what it teaches you, right? So really cool stuff that's saying we're not going to start at how the university understands teaching. We're going to start at how we understand knowledge construction and teaching, and we're going to move from there. The downside is that was completely funded by a research grant. So how do you what happens when that research grant funding runs out? Well, I can tell you they're talking about cutting it, because the cost of taking students out to those different places is huge. Well, actually, it's not huge compared to what they're willing to spend money on. And then you have really cool stuff happening in the South Pacific, where people are talking about how do we bring waka and navigating and all the stuff. Pacific people were some of the original scientists. We never should have trusted Cook and shown him how to find places. So how do we bring that ancient knowledge into our classrooms so that we can teach that knowledge and reaffirm Pacific people as scientists, because we've always have been. And then I think that there's how do you get the structure? So one of the things that happened recently, so in New Zealand, they rank every academic from A to D, I think, or C, and that depends how much money your institution gets for the next 6 years for research. So it's the PBRF process, and we just had a review of that, and that review came out just after we wrote the papers about the percentage of Māori and Pacific academics, and a Pakaru pipeline paper. As a result, that probably not just our work, but a lot of other conversations, but as a result, there was peer review papers that they were able to put into that review, double weight Māori and Pacific research. And the kickback from that, people were really angry Someone said it's not, you know, the PBRF isn't a social control mechanism, and I was like, that's exactly what it is. You know, it's just that now we're changing the rules to benefit Māori and Pacific. You don't want it to be a social control initiative. And so every time we make a little bit of headway, we get pushed back. And so I do think there's really cool things happening. It's just about what Stephen said, which is how do we make it permanent? How do we resource it so the institutions value it? And we see some of it in New Zealand's research funding. So we see it in the rethinking of the PBRF. We see it in Vision Mātauranga. So how does your research serve Māori communities, or how does Māori knowledge inform your research in our research funding bodies? But we're not going to get, we can't rely on universities just being good people. There has to be, unfortunately, there has to be resources tied to it, or they do not change. They don't. And so how do we use their language to change them? And the one place I would also suggest you look at is Decolonial Futures, which is a project by Vanessa Andriotti, where she's looking at, it's an international project, looking at how do you embed Indigenous knowledge systems and what is possible and what is impossible in the universities. And so like they did a summer course where we go out to a Sundance ceremony and engaging with a Sundance ceremony, and also some really heavy theory. And how do Indigenous communities articulate change and push for change? And so that's quite a cool, at the moment, I think they're in Brazil too. There's so many examples out there. It's just that a lot of it is temporary funding, and you just wait for the next restructure to say it's not possible anymore, unfortunately. Yeah.
Thanks so much for that.
Really great to hear about local initiatives, although there are of course some similar themes there, that they're rather tenuous although excellent initiatives. Yeah, really cool to hear what's going on in your universities. Did we have one other question? Otherwise we can leave it there. Anybody else in our audience? Thanks, Sereana. Okie dokie. Well, a very, very big thank you, of course, to Sereana.
We have one more, Marie. Sorry.
Oh,
Nicholas
I'm
just
sorry, I missed you. Where are we? Nicholas.
Hi. Yes, thank you. Just not a question, just a comment. Sereana, I made the comment about the tensions between the emotions, which I think has already been covered. And that's really what I'm interested in, is looking at how tensions between seemingly contradictory emotions, which Laura raised, are agents for change. And it's consistent with the theoretical work in activity theory, which is where I ground my work. And so it's nice to hear it come through in other theories and in other work. Yeah, so just to comment on that, I'd never really thought about the potential for contradictions in emotions in terms of equity. And that's really why I participated in this seminar. So it's useful to think of it in those terms. And it's so obvious now that I hear about the conversations around it, the role of emotions in equity in higher education. So just to say thank you for the contributions and for that today.
Thank you, Nicholas. Let's have a longer discussion. Thank you.
Sorry to cut you off there at the beginning, Nicholas. Did anybody else have a question?
I just got a comment, really.
Yeah.
I don't want to keep anyone if people need to run off. I was thinking it would be interesting to reflect maybe at a later point down the road, not just on the obstacles posed by the corporate university to leveraging resources for social justice initiatives, but also the opportunities, because it's so, for example, this is the case for hope, right? One thing I was thinking about was that the increased say that universities are giving to students in how their education is run, the student as a client or consumer model, right? I feel like that, you know, that can be a very bad thing, but it also could be harnessed in the sense that, you know, universities are now very reliant on attracting students through these kind of big PR campaigns. And so I think students actually have an increased voice in this space. And so the collective efforts of student activists, I think, are really important. And just one, I think, amazing example from the University of Sydney, where I was based for a very long time, student activists would kind of pierce these kind of corporate imaginaries that were appearing on university mission statements all around the campus by making their own posters. So they would take all of the, you know, so Stephen, you were talking about this language of renewal that the university is using, you know, at the University of Sydney, we have these, you know, reimagining things and unlearning campaigns. And so what these students do is to take the iconography of these posters, mimic them, and then put up their own around the campus, you know, and basically exposing all the ways in which, in a cynical, witty, sarcastic way, in which the universities are really failing to live up to these kind of mission statements and buzzwords. So I think, yeah, there's opportunity, you know, so there's opportunities in the corporate university to make them feel uncomfortable and to shame them using their tools against them in a way. Anyway, that's just a comment.
That is a great idea, and we should perhaps think about having another discussion that's slightly more solutions focused. But yeah, mobilizing humor. Stephen mentioned, like, don't give up, the gold stars, and like using diversity speak to get what you want. These are, yeah, all things that we must keep in mind also when things are tough. Yeah. So sorry, Millicent, I'll just move you back there. Thanks again to Sereana and Stephen, ngā mihi, for sharing your knowledge and your insights. And thanks all to all the attendees for being here. Some of us, it's quite late, and some of you it's kind of early, so really appreciate you engaging in the discussions with us. We'd also like to thank the New Zealand Royal Society for providing funding for the network. And just finally, you might have seen some of our email communications that we've sent out. We've got some other activities planned for the rest of the year. We have another online panel discussion in the middle of the year on gender and affect. There's also a day-long symposium at the International Critical Health Psychology Conference in August that's taking place in Wellington. And if you haven't already, do sign up and join our network so we can keep you in the loop with other activities. And if you want to reach out to us to discuss other ideas for panel discussions, or for us to share ideas and to help us grow this community, just, yeah, get in touch. But thank you so much all for joining us. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks for being on. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for being here.